Welcome to our fourth and final segment of the 2025 Poolside Proficiency Series, Building Level Appropriate Language. My name is Carolyn Taylor, and I'm an instructional strategist with Wayside Publishing. As a reminder, this webinar is only one part of the overall professional learning available for this topic. In addition to this recorded webinar, be sure to access the Poolside Proficiency document, where you'll find a related blog post, podcast episode, and an opportunity to reflect and read reactions from other educators. You will also find a link to register for our second and final live event on August 11th. And if you're interested, you can request a professional learning certificate to receive credit for interacting with this content. Here are our learning goals for our time together today. So we'd like you to be able to implement some best practices to present language in context, and to provide level appropriate language to novice and intermediate learners. And finally, we're hoping that you'll be able to recognize ranges of language performance among learners. Throughout today's webinar, I will be referring to several resources to help us explore aspects of providing level appropriate language in the classroom. You can access them using the QR code or URL you see here. We're going to start off today's topic, providing level appropriate language, by considering the role of input. But what exactly is input? Van Patten defines input as the language that learners see or hear in a communicative context in which they're trying to understand the meaning. Well, what is the role of input in our classrooms, and how does it factor into helping students acquire language and grow their language proficiency? According to Van Patten's research on second language acquisition, students first need a great deal of input in communicative contexts, followed by multiple opportunities to interact with that input. Let's think about this within the context of using authentic resources as a tool to provide input for students. When using authentic resources, we want to make sure that the language input we're providing is level appropriate, engaging, and supports the context. In this way, we help ensure that for the most part, students understand what you're communicating. Then, students use the input you provide as a basis to come up with output as they build up to being ready to participate in speaking and writing activities. Two instances where input is especially important is when we're teaching new vocabulary and new grammar concepts. As we consider the role of input, we need to ensure that it is central to the lesson. The input has to be comprehensible and age appropriate. The tasks we provide have to have a purpose, and it's not just rote practice or drilling. And tasks involve the expression and interpretation of meaning. What does Van Patten mean when he says communicative context? A communicative context is the situation in which communication occurs. So in other words, the who, what, where, and why of a communicative interaction. Giving students this context provides a framework to build understanding, and it helps motivate our language learners. Students see how the language is used in the real world outside of the classroom. Then, how do we create a communicative context when presenting vocabulary? Instead of just looking at the what or the isolated vocabulary chunks related to the unit, We can look at the questions where, who, and why to add context to the vocabulary. Where is the communication taking place? Where would students need to use these terms? Who's involved? Who might they speak to or write to while using this language? And what is the purpose or what meaning is there to the communication? In other words, why are they communicating? Remember to keep level appropriate language in mind. What will students realistically be able to do in the target language if they wanted to communicate in a given situation? For example, they won't be able to understand everything a native speaker is telling them, but they will be able to pick up on keywords and main ideas and rely on context clues and gestures to get by. And keep in mind that learners most effectively acquire language when you meet their current level of language and add one level of difficulty. Think of it as moving students just a little bit side out of their comfort zone. I like to think of it as being in the Goldilocks zone, at the I+1 level, where learners experience language that's just a little bit beyond what they currently understand, making the level of what they're taking in just right. Let's focus on characteristics of input and output. For our language learners, they go hand in hand. To help us provide level appropriate language for our students, here are some important considerations. So, beyond words, we need to use the nonverbal communication, so visuals, gestures. We also learn by being immersed in the language that we can mostly grasp, and then it's up to us to figure out the rest. And in turn, here are some key ideas to keep in mind when it comes to students using the language in speaking and in writing. So, the spoken and written language focuses on communicating a message, not accuracy. There will be a time for accuracy, but when students are beginning to acquire a new concept, we want to focus on the understanding and starting to try to use the focus concept. So, errors, as we know ourselves as language learners, they're an expected and necessary part of learning. That's how we learn. Students build self confidence when they're able to express themselves and communicate even when their message is somewhat flawed. Right? So, the bottom line, students being able to use the language and create with it, express their ideas and needs and opinions, that is what is so important, even if mistakes and errors come along with it. So, how do input and output work together? What's the relationship between the two? So, comprehensible input is the driver. It's what sets students up for being able to produce output. So, teachers provide extensive input. So, keep in mind that what we're providing as input needs to be of interest to the students, it has to be engaging. And there needs to be a follow-up where students are able to use what they're learning to communicate in real-world contexts. And keep in mind the role of the silent period. Some of our students need more input before they feel ready to speak or write. And then others are ready to try it out even after they've just had a little bit of input coming in. Now let's contrast input and output. Think of inner versus outer. Input, language that we receive, what we're taking in, versus output, what comes out, what we produce when speaking and writing. And as language learners, we need both. Let's consider control. With input, teachers have more control over the level of language they provide. We know up front the meaning we want to convey to help students acquire certain vocabulary, grammar structures, cultural concepts, and so on. It's like we're using GPS when we're traveling. We know our destination and the route we're going to follow to get there. Now, on the other hand, student output can be all over the map because their language use is a work in progress. We expect that they'll make mistakes because mistakes are a natural and expected part of acquiring language. And yet, sometimes they surprise us with error-free, well-constructed responses at their given proficiency level. So, in a nutshell, the focus of input is all about comprehension, while output is about students communicating their ideas and opinions. Now that we have characteristics of input and output fresh in our minds, let's talk strategy with reminders and tools to help you put into action in your classroom. Here's a great resource courtesy of Leslie Gren that you can use as a reference tool to help you stay on track with providing effective language input for your students. I like how it provides support as you plan your lessons. For example, Planning Checklist helps you incorporate elements that help make language comprehensible to students. The context descriptions remind us how to make input relevant and interesting to students. The scaffolded questions are helpful to use in checking for understanding. And I recommend posting the reminders somewhere in your classroom where you'll notice them and can refer to them periodically just to make sure you're incorporating those elements into your teaching. This checklist is another resource courtesy of Leslie Grahn, and it's an important tool to help teachers stay on track with providing comprehensible input for their learners. Next, let's see input in action and how we can make it comprehensible for our learners. First, we'll check out teaching vocabulary and context. Notice the list on the right. This is probably familiar to many of us as both language students and teachers. While there's a place for this list in our teaching practice, let's explore introducing students to vocabulary by using it in context. On the left, we've got an image from Entre Culturas, Level 1, that's used to introduce vocabulary. As a teacher, I'm going to present this to students using the words and phrases in short sentences, asking my students lots of questions. It might sound like this in the target language. So, I love apples. Do you like apples? How much do the apples cost? When I go to the market, I always buy apples. I'm making a fruit salad. Let's see what fruits are available. I see strawberries, grapes, papayas, and pineapple. You can give them a scenario. For example, tell them that they have 75 pesos and they need to buy fruits and vegetables for dinner. What would they buy? By presenting vocabulary in this way, I'm going beyond teaching students words in isolation. Students are able to see and hear how those words are used, and they're learning new words and structures as I'm speaking. I am modeling good language use for them as I'm presenting. And as I go through this process, I'm keeping level appropriate language in mind. Am I using comprehensible language for my students? Meaning, am I using language or input they can understand, plus a little more challenging than where they currently are? And am I also expecting level appropriate output from my students? So if they're novice speakers, I'd be looking for one word answers, maybe some short memorized phrases. Now let's focus on teaching grammar and context. Both of these items are also from Wayside Resources and serve very different purposes. One presents the new structure in context, focusing on meaning, while the other focuses on form. And just as we teach vocabulary in context, we also teach grammar in context, starting from a place of meaning, by helping students understand what the grammar structure means before we analyze how to form it. On the right, we see a verb chart that again is probably very familiar to many of us as language teachers and language learners. The chart has its place in the classroom, but when we're introducing new structures to our students, this is not where I'll start. On the left, we have a postcard from Entre Culture Level 1, written by Raoul, who lives in Togo. He's writing to his friend Isabelle, who lives in France. The text includes different forms of the verb aller, or to go, as Raoul talks about some of the places he and his family like to go. In the postcard, students see the same verb forms that appear in the table on the right, except the postcard helps students understand the various forms of the verb because there's meaning attached. They're not simply memorizing the forms in an isolated chart with no meaning attached. Here are two contrasting approaches to teaching grammar. The first follows a deductive approach, and this is the traditional approach of teaching all of the rules, and then, of course, all the exceptions to the rules, first, and then allowing learners to see the grammar structure in use and to manipulate it through drills and practice type activities. I know I've experienced a lot of lessons like these, both as a student and as a teacher. In this model, teachers take responsibility for understanding, constructing the knowledge, and students are just passive participants along for the ride. Now, let's contrast this with inductive teaching. This approach allows students to see or hear the language within a meaningful context, preferably through authentic resources. For example, learning when to use the imperfect versus the past tense while talking about childhood memories. One fantastic tool to help you teach grammar inductively is the PACE model. So here are the steps to the cycle. The P stands for present. So this is where we're presenting the new grammar structure as a concept, as an idea, and we're presenting it in context. The A is when we draw students' attention to that new grammar structure. C is where students co-construct the grammar rules. So they're coming up with those rules through analyzing, hypothesizing, and predicting how, when, and why that structure is used. The E stands for extension. So this is where we give them extension activities so that they have more input with that new structure so they can build the foundation to then create output with it. And then that cycle continues through. Here are three key concepts to focus on of the PACE model. So we want to focus on form only after students have understood the meaning. Students understand the grammar structure as a concept, and then the context has to be relevant and interesting to our learners. To give you an idea of what the PACE model looks like in action, I'm going to share with you how we approach teaching of grammar in our Entre Cultures, Entre Culturas, and Interculturel resources. We use an inductive approach called the discovery process throughout our French, German, and Spanish textbook series. As you can see here, there are 5 steps in this process. I'll briefly highlight these 5 steps within the context of a découvrant or a grammar segment in our Level 1 French book. This is a great guide to use as you're deciding how to present a grammar concept to students. And in order to use the first step, students must have content to process for meaning. Whatever the text type might be, whether it's a song, an email, a poster, a video segment, etc. In other words, they need examples of the structure used in context at a level that's challenging for them, but that they can still understand. Students read this example with the target structure. The context here is where people like to go, mainly for leisure activities. We're introducing the verb aller, meaning to go, within the context of the vocabulary students are learning, which happens to be the activities they enjoy doing. So you could start by asking several clarification questions that would require a yes or no response. So for example, is Raul's brother going to the stadium? So students would respond that he's not, right? And then you can reinforce their understanding of the va form, that's the third person singular, by saying, yeah, that's correct. Raul's brother isn't going to the stadium, he's going to the pool. He's going there with his parents. Raul's brother and their parents go to the pool. So through that process, they're hearing the various forms of the verb in bold in context. And then after answering some yes or no questions, then move to either or questions for students to answer. In this step that we see here highlighting the structure, we're still just pointing out the structure for students, but this is an interpretive activity still. You might use a PowerPoint with slides of various people doing different activities mentioned in the postcard. And as you show each slide, describe where the people are going based on each picture. Now we're ready for students to do some detective work. With the help of the guiding questions you see here, called découverte, students answer the questions, which helps them make predictions about how, when, and why the verb aller is used. The graphic organizer facilitates a guided think, pair, share discussion with students. As students are testing their predictions, they'll create examples of sentences using the form of aller with what they actually do. And as the teacher is writing the phrases, students can help create them. At the same time, while engaged in the activity, students are testing their predictions. Did they guess correctly when and where the use of the different forms of aller take place? Did they notice all of the different forms of aller that are used? And do they know what they mean? Can they make sense of the phrases that are being written as a class? Next, students move through a variety of activities in the interpretive mode within a meaningful context to help them understand features of the grammar concept and how it's used. And once they've completed additional interpretive activities, they're ready to start communicating using the structure. The key here is remembering that students need to understand the structure before they create output with it. Put another way, they have to comprehend it before they can produce it in speaking and in writing. And we also have to keep in mind what that level appropriate output will look like. For my novice learners, for example, I should not expect students to use strings of sentences and connectors. Instead, they'll be using chunks of language with memorized phrases. Here is a really valuable resource to help you grow your understanding of what level appropriate output looks like. If you aren't already familiar with ACTFL's performance descriptors for language learners, I highly recommend that you read through them and refer to them often to support your teaching. They are a key tool to guide you in creating performance tasks, setting realistic expectations, and designing assessments that show what learners can do with their current proficiency level and what they need to do to level up. Building on our previous webinar, session 3, where we talked about features of novice and intermediate level language, let's think now about what students should be able to do across novice low to intermediate low levels based on the can-do statements we see here. The can-dos helps identify where your learners are along the proficiency continuum and what type of output you should expect from them. They give students a framework to rate themselves on how well they meet those can-do statements. So let's look at some key concepts for each of the levels, the sub-levels that we see here. So our novice low kids can repeat just single words or very short phrases. And this is content that they've heard, multiple times and that they've memorized. They can do simple transactions like greeting one another. They can present themselves, give their name. They can list off a few things around them, right? They're able to answer with yes or no questions. And so things that they'd be working on would be to learn more words and phrases and then build their comprehension on, content that they read or they hear. And then they're building up to ask some simple questions. Now, as they transition into the novice mid, here's where they start to use different words and phrases that they've heard and memorized. They've got more, vocabulary in their toolbox to work with. Now, instead of just giving their name, they can introduce themselves, right? They can greet others in different ways, and they can talk a little bit about their likes and dislikes. They're able to ask simple questions, and they can list things that are pertinent to the context that they're talking about. And then they can give the date and time, talk a little bit about the weather. And what they're working on to get better is to speak in simple but full sentences. And then being able to circumlocute a little bit, explain the words that they don't know. And then working on asking more kinds of questions. And then building on fluency, they're focusing on hesitating just a little bit less when speaking. And as they move up to the novice high level, here's where they can provide information using words, phrases, and short sentences. They're building their confidence to speak. They're still using practice subjects like, giving basic information about themselves, talking about what they like to do, describing their surroundings and people in their community and their environment. And then they can start to give their opinions. They can share what they like, what they dislike, what they're maybe indifferent to. They're using words that help connect, like, have, with, etc. And they can ask simple questions, and they're able to read and understand or listen to the main ideas. They can pull those out from what they're taking in. And what they're working on is to be able to speak in complete sentences. They're focusing on the accuracy of the verb forms that they're using. And then they're able to take the conversation that they're in and shift it into new directions to build on it. And then they're able to handle new questions or new situations. And then as they approach the intermediate low level, here they're able to speak more confidently and speak incomplete sentences. And this is pivotal. Here they're now able to create with language and answer open-ended questions, right? They're not just relying on yes, no, either or. They're really able to express themselves, answering those open-ended questions. Now, they're mostly using the present tense verb forms correctly, and then they can describe things and people in more detail, right? And they can give their opinions not just on selected focus topics, but they're branching out to talk about, a variety of topics. And they're realizing when they make errors, and they're able to correct themselves when they misspeak. And then they can use some appropriate pointed questions. What they're working on is really all about quantity and quality. Right? They are using lots of different language and, wanting to use it correctly. And they realize the importance of improving their use of present tense verbs and the forms of adjectives. And they're not hesitating too much when speaking. And finally, here are some additional strategies that you can use with learners that tailor output expectations across those levels. And again, we're focusing here on the novice and intermediate levels. As we wrap up, I invite you to write down your thoughts on these 3 ideas. So, what would you like to discontinue in light of what we're learning about level appropriate language in our classrooms? What is something that you really want to learn more about? You might need to do some research on. And then finally, what are you ready to move forward with? What do you want to dive right into? And finally, if you would like to receive a certificate for participating in today's professional learning session, you can scan the QR code here or go to the URL that you see to request that form. And then once you've filled it out, you'll receive an email with a link to register for our second and final live event. So mark your calendars for August 11th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, and we really hope to see you there. From all of us on the professional learning team at Wayside, thank you for joining us for Poolside Proficiency. For those of you who haven't gone back to school yet, enjoy the rest of your summer, and we wish you all a great start to the new school year.